Hello and welcome, and in today's video I'm going to share with you the top 10 creatures which you need for the island, so let's get into it. In at number 10 is the Deon, and there is no doubt that this is one of the most useful creatures on the island, namely for its bossing abilities. Obviously this isn't going to be the creature which is going to defeat any kind of boss. It does not have the melee damage to do that, but if you level up this thing's food stat like absolute crazy, and then you can use this thing to heal up your dinosaurs in the boss fight, which is a very useful thing, and especially because there's no things like stars on the island. Yes, you can transfer, but all the creatures on this list do natively spawn on the island, so don't expect any others. The Deon is pretty much your only option out there, and its ability is just so good, and it is so easy to use. The only real downside being the amount of meat it consumes, and you're going to need to really pump that hunger, but it actually isn't too bad, and it is definitely worth it. In at number 9 is the Baselo, and this creature is pretty much your best bet for doing any kind of cave runs which you'll find out there. Obviously underwater ones, this thing is not a land creature, and I think there are 2 underwater caves on the island, one of the artifacts being used for the Megapithecus and one of them being used for the dragon. I'm pretty sure there's only 2, yeah, there's only 2 underwater caves, and the Basilosaurus is going to be extremely useful in all of those cases. It has the damage to deal some of a fight. Yes, it isn't going to stack up to the Mosasaur, but the fact that this thing is immune to electric eels and jellyfish and all those things makes this one of the most safe creatures to take into the ocean, as most of the threats are now just not even able to do their main abilities. The only thing you really have to take into mind is the fact that they have a depth limit, but as a nice little bonus, these things will also passively make oil. Next up, we have the Uranus, and again, compared to the Deon, the story is very similar. This is a great boss creature, which I think is highly essential for the island, and it is useful on all 3 of those boss fights, and it definitely is one which you'll want to use at some point 100%, as obviously this isn't going to deal the damage in the boss fight, although you could use uses for that. That's not really their use case, and they're not going to heal up the creatures because that's the Deon's job. This thing will buff up all of those creatures with its all famous courage roar, and courageous you can also be if you drop a quick sub on the channel. It is always greatly appreciated. But it also does have the fear roar as well, which isn't particularly useful for bosses due to the size limit on the fear roar, but if someone's trying to raid your base in PvP on a Pteranodon, then you can use the fear roar if you have a Uranus on you, and they will have no chance in raiding you or scouting your base out whatsoever. Good PvP tip if you didn't know that already. In at number 7 is the Aloe, and this creature is a really great entry-level carnivore on the island, and you may get somewhat angry with what I've put in the number 2 spot. If you know me already, you'll know what's in that spot, and you might want to put the Aloe in the number 2 spot, and the creature which is in number 2 in this spot, and that is totally fine. You can form your own opinions on these dinosaurs. This is just my take, as albeit the Aloe is an amazing creature, inflicting a great amount of bleed damage and having a very useful pack buff, it just isn't my go-to carnivore of choice, as it is a little bit too out of reach in terms of the level in some ways of when it is unlocked, as it is a much harder tame than the other one that is on this list, obviously. And also, I kind of don't like the size as much. I prefer those smaller carnivores. I just feel like I have a little bit more protection, and albeit the Aloe is much more powerful than the creature which shall not be named, which is obviously in the number 2 spot, the Aloe is just, I don't know, it's just not as appealing to me in a lot of ways. But I will definitely say that it is a truly amazing creature, which if you get the chance to on the island, which everyone realistically should, and especially on ASA, as they are so easy to tame with the new baby dino mechanic, you really can't miss out on taming a pack of Aloes. Remember, pack size is always 3, so if your pack aren't working, if you only have 2 Aloes, get a 3rd one and that pack buff will appear. Next up on the list we have the Rex, and this is pretty much your go-to boss creature which you can use on the island. Although in the honourable mentions section of this video there are a couple of other creatures which are great boss creatures but which sadly didn't make it on my top 10, but they may have made it on yours. Either way, back to talking about the Rex, you can kind of tell why this is such a great boss creature. It is a big, hunking carnivore with great big teeth and a lot of power. And compared to a lot of other carnivores, I feel like I'm saying a lot, just did say it twice in a sentence there, but either way, compared to other carnivores, this thing's health is actually way higher than loads of the other options, making it the ideal boss creature for you to go with, as it is just such a balanced creature. While yes, it isn't the carnivore which deals the most amount of damage on the island, which is still allowed into bosses. The Giga I'm not counting here, as the Giga is sort of in a different league as a carnivore, but in terms of things like the Spino, yes, it will deal more damage, but its health is a lot lower, so the Rex is usually the go-to, and the Rex is significantly easier to tame, and its saddle also doesn't require silica pulse to craft, which can be a very big annoyance. Although at that stage of the game it isn't too much of a hindrance, it still can be a bit of one. In at number 5 is the Thyla, and there is a lot to say about the Thyla, and this creature is just so good at so many things, and it is actually one of the most versatile Ark creatures in my opinion. I've just done a top 10 on that recently, so if you go look on the channel you can see that top 10 if you're keen on it. And also in terms of the Thyla's abilities, obviously apart from it just being versatile, this thing is a really great climber of all things. You saw it climb redwood trees there, but it can climb any kind of wall or vertical surface. Although meshing and meshes is a big glitch on ASA at the moment, so you can get yourself into some pretty sticky situations with terrain, and even fall through the terrain if you know that's your thing. But you know, ASA is still an early access game. They could have definitely worked on it a lot more though. But in terms of its other abilities as well, it isn't just a really great travel mount. Although it is a great use for it, it is also a really great carnivore, sadly not being allowed into boss fights. But I guess we have the Deinonychus on Valguero if you want a boss creature with kind of similar abilities to this, as that creature can also climb, but it is allowed into bosses, and in my opinion, it is better than the Thyla, but that doesn't spawn on the island, so therefore it does not qualify for this list. But the main reason for its great attack is obviously that bleed ability which it has. Barely any other carnivores have this, which kind of doesn't make sense considering what they're doing and then literally ripping right into a creature. You'd expect bleed damage to occur, but most carnivores don't even use that ability. And the fact that this has it is a huge bonus. Next up, we have the Ther. And would it really be a list without the Ther here? This creature is just so useful for so many things, it had to be put on this list. The Freddy Krueger of Ark, with its saddle unlocked at level 69.
Nice.
This thing really does pack a punch in all of its abilities. Namely, its fiber gathering, which barely any creatures can stack up to. Although the Moss Drops is a great shout in the early game. Sadly, it isn't on the list or in the honourable mentions, but you know, I guess it got a little mention here with the Ther. But also the Ther is great at gathering berries as well, and so with wood and thatch too. And it is a pretty good meat gatherer as well, as this thing really does pack a punch in terms of damage. And it is the go-to creature for doing the dragon boss fight, as that boss is very unfair to all kinds of carnivores, and it is really nice to have this creature as a backup. Although the only real downside is sweet vegetable cake is the only way that you can really heal these things up in a quick manner. But if you have a Deon with you, that really shouldn't be too much of an issue. In at number 3, we have the Baryonyx. And would it really be a top 10 the Island Creatures list without this thing appearing at some point? This is by far the best caving creature on the island, and there is no competition at all. No creature can stack up to this thing in all of its abilities. It is just so good at caving, it has to be put on this list for all of its greatness in every aspect of caving. It's the right size and it deals a heavy amount of damage with a reasonable health stat, great stamina and great weight to go with it too. There is nothing which could really be improved about with this creature. Maybe apart from it not eating normal meat instead of fish meat, and the fact that it spawns in the swamp isn't great, but I'm happy to take those as some side effects for a creature which is just this good. It is almost too good to be true. And it also does have a right click attack in the water which can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon, and it is a very, very viable solution if you don't have a Basilosaurus for the underwater caves on the island. And this is the creature which I said when I was talking about the Aloe, you may be a little bit upset at this being in the number 2 spot, but I absolutely adore the Carno in so many ways. It has to be put on the number 2 slot for me. The also amount of nostalgia I get from this creature is insane, and it has the bleed ability too, and although it doesn't have the pack buff, it is a much more manageable size, and also it is a very nice carnivore to control as well. Albeit the Aloe has a nice turning circle and all of that, but the Carno really just feels much nicer to control, and in my opinion it is just a better designed creature. And also with its comedically small arms, you have something to laugh about with this thing too, and it just has so much character around it. And again, its saddle level being in the 40s or 50s, I can't remember. You see, it's one of those. It's very achievable for any Ark player really if you just put a little bit of effort into the game. It is a really great carnivore in the early stages, of obviously mid stages as well. And you don't even need the saddle to fully utilize this creature. You can just have it following you around on adventures until you get that saddle, and you could be leveling up along the way to get it ready for when you first ride it. A very good, very good strategy actually, considering that trank arrows unlock at level 21, and from there it is really easy to make a basic wooden trap and just trank this thing out. You really cannot go wrong with the Carno. But before we get into number 1, I have a few quick honorable mentions. And finally, in at number 1, we have the RG. And really, what did you expect? This thing is an absolute beast of a creature which really does deserve to be respected. And it is a go-to on all maps except Arboration and Gen 1, as obviously flyers aren't allowed on those maps. But on all other maps, you need an RG really. These creatures are just that useful. They are the pinnacle of metal resource gathering, and when paired with something like an Anki or a Dodic, which I'm kind of going to tie into the number 1 spot here, as they really work well together as creatures, you have yourself pretty much the best harvesting creature combination which you could possibly have. The RG has weight reduction on things like metal, crystal, obsidian, and much more, and paired with something like the Anki, which can gather insane amounts of metal, it really is set up for success. And the RG deals a reasonable amount of damage as well, has a great weight stat and a great stamina stat, which is actually why the stamina didn't even make the top 10 list, as usually I'll just go straight to the RG, and albeit the Pteranodon is a good tame which is great for beginners and very beginner friendly, I always just go straight for the RG and don't even bother with the Pteranodon. And on top of that as well, its saddle acts as a portable smithy, which is a nice thing if one of your metal weapons breaks out on your travels, or your flak armor in cave runs, and also it has a nice little neat regen buff if you eat a dead corpse. This creature is amazing.
At number 10, we have got the Galley, and I'm sorry to all Syntac lovers out there, or just Galley lovers out there, or maybe Syntac himself if he's even watching this video, because the Galley is a staple creature for him, but for me, I really just don't like this as a creature. It doesn't really have much use to me, and it is so irritating and annoying to tame. Not necessarily just because it is a difficult tame, it's not actually a hugely difficult tame, apart from the fact they die so often when taming one. You'll need trank darts instead of trank arrows. If you use trank arrows, you're just going to kill one of these things. Once you have one, their weight isn't actually that great, so you're probably not actually going to be able to get loads of resources across the map at the speed that a Gallimimus can just go at default, because this is their default speed. Yes, albeit pretty quick, but still, considering their health and their feebleness in everything else, they really just aren't a good creature and they're not worth the tame whatsoever. And their saddle was actually kind of expensive for what they do as well, although that doesn't make a bad creature. It's just another deficit again, which again makes these creatures just even less enticing to use for me. You can always just use like the Procoptodon, which was just there. That is a much better creature, which is just so much more robust in all of its features, and the Galley just doesn't have that. And it's kind of a shame, because there's an essence of community with this creature, with obviously YouTubers like Syntac, but most people kind of know you don't really tame the Galley, you kind of avoid this creature, and it's a little bit of the meme. And I was actually going to put the Dodo here instead, but I can't do that to the Dodo, can I? And also the Dodo's really useful for simple kibble, so it definitely isn't deserving on the list. Unlike the AI list, which put the Dodo right in the #1 spot. Definitely would not do that. Next up, we have got the Paky, and this creature kind of had to be here when you think of it. Like, this creature is so unnecessarily long to tame with its actual tame. It's not very difficult to tame. It's not like the process is complicated. It just takes ages to tame these things, and they're not even particularly useful. They can't even gather berries, and they kind of one use could be dealing torpor, but it's in such a controlled little area, and also it'll do more damage than actual torpor. They still don't deal a lot of damage. Anyway, it's just not worth using these creatures for that use, and they're just really slow and not particularly useful for absolutely anything. If they're a berry gatherer, then maybe it would improve a lot, and possibly I'm being pretty dumb, but I have never been able to gather berries with these things, and I'm pretty sure you can't. If you could, then tell me down below, and my opinion might change these things slightly, but still, I really don't think they're good tames. It's just a waste of a position. Get yourself a parasol that can gather berries, and they are so much of a better creature in the early game. Like, yeah, it could kill a raptor, but it took like over a minute for it to do this. Obviously, I had to edit the video so it would actually fit in the B-roll, but it's just really not a good creature. Don't tame one. Next up, we have got the Archaopteryx, and I'm just putting this thing here partly because its taming food is unnecessary. It uses chitin. Really? Why? Also, these things spawn in the redwoods, not the friendliest biome to tame in, and since the glide suit came out, they really aren't useful, so I have to put them in the worst Ark creatures list, as there is absolutely no use for these creatures anymore whatsoever. This creature is useless. To carry this thing around, it's just a slog, and you can't really get much use out of it. Just get a normal flyer. It's actually easier to get a Pteranodon than one of these things, as the biome when you tame one of these things isn't particularly friendly, and a Pteranodon is going to be so much better than this creature, or even like any just flyer or glider. It's going to like wipe this thing out of the park. There is no use for this creature to be in Ark. But also, the cinema crops exist, so this doesn't need to be here. At number 7, we have got the Microraptor, and again, we kind of have a useless creature. This thing can't really do anything in particular at all, and obviously, maybe, yeah, you could use it to knock players off of mounts. There are just better creatures, like the Desmodus can pick players off of mounts, and it still is quite a finicky use case, and it doesn't work very well or effectively. There really is not a huge use for these creatures to be used in that scenario, so they're just pretty obsolete, and again, not the friendliest to tame because they often come in packs, and they're just an absolute pain to deal with, kind of like Palovias, although Palovias do have a slight use, so obviously I'm not putting the general Palovia on this list. They don't need to be here. Next up, we have got the Oviraptor. Some people might say this is an unpopular opinion to put here, and surely the Archaeopteryx and the Microraptor are less useful than this thing, as it kind of increases the rate that eggs will be laid by creatures, but it isn't an essential thing to me, at least, and maybe to people that do want loads of them, I have a feeling it's not going to make the biggest difference. Maybe the Oviraptor is an insane creature to you, but the taming method is pretty unnecessary, and I really don't like these things as a creature, and I think their use case is kind of pretty useless, like the Dimetrodon and incubating eggs. Just use air conditioners. I know there isn't really an alternative for this creature. I just think it's really useless. Next up, we have got the Areno, and this creature is so useless. Like, its tame method is a really annoying passive tame, and on top of that as well, it just really doesn't have much use of a creature. I'm going to put the Titanoboa here as well, as it kind of follows under a similar league. Obviously not the same tame method as Titanoboa's tame method, is arguably even worse, and that creature is arguably even less useful, especially considering the new kibble system, whereas before it did actually have a use, and nowadays it doesn't. Just these two creatures, they can't do anything. They're unnecessary tames, and there's no use to these things being in the Ark game at all. Maybe if the Areno could climb walls and the Titanoboa was still useful for kibble, they wouldn't be here on this list, but they're useless, so they are. Next up, we have got the Pego, and I'm going to kind of put the, well, actually, I'm not. People might say, well, why wouldn't I put the Ichthyornis here? Well, the Ichthyornis actually kind of has a use. It can gather back black pearls and all of that stuff. So, no, it does not deserve to be on the worst Ark creatures list. And I've been throwing the word useless around, but this is still the worst Ark creatures list, not the most useless. But they are, in some ways, big synonyms of each other. But the Pego kind of does have one use, which is it can actually gather berries. What am I turning into a northerner now? It can gather berries for you, which is actually quite a nice feature for a creature like this to have. Although you're taming these things on accident, no one's actually going out to tame one of these things the way you tame one. You just put berries in your last slot, your hotbar, and then it will steal them, and then it will tame. So you can tell how that would happen on accident. And all of my Pego tames have been on accident, and they're really just not useful. They don't do anything. They just sit on your shoulder and do nothing, and there's nothing that you can really do with them. Again, kind of falling into the worst Ark creatures list. It just doesn't. It doesn't do anything. It can't do anything, and it doesn't really need to do anything because it's not really a big part of the Ark game. It's just a huge annoyance of a creature, and once tamed, you really just can't get anything out of it whatsoever. At number 3, we have got the female Megalosaurus. The male one is actually a pretty good thatch gatherer, but the female one cannot attack whatsoever, so it has to be on the list. It is essentially just used to breed Megalosauruses, so then you could get a better male Megalosaurus for better thatch gathering. Don't know why my words are not working today, but yeah, this creature is useless apart from that one thing, which is why it's here. It is such a bad Ark creature. You can't do anything with it whatsoever. You can ride it, and you can jump around with it, and you can move around the map with it. It can't attack though, like the Diplo, but at least the Diplo has knockback, and the Diplo is a good berry gatherer. That gives it some merit. This thing just can't do anything. It feels like whenever you press the attack button or something, if you're looking to that, it just feels like this creature hasn't been coded properly, like there's something wrong with it. But no, there is nothing wrong with it, and if you ever tame one of these things, I don't know why you would, unless obviously you're breeding, and you don't know they don't attack, well, now you do, because these things don't attack, so don't tame it unless you're doing breeding. Really, just one of the worst Ark creatures. Why don't you at least give these things an attack? And at number 2, we have got the Compsognathus, or just the Compy. It's called the Compy in Ark. Don't know why I decided to do the whole long fancy name, but hey ho. And this creature can only be tamed with prime meat. Its torpor goes down ridiculously fast, and once tamed, maybe you could send it to attack something slightly. Really just doesn't have a use. And I'm kind of going to put the Listro here as an honorable mention as well, because it follows a similar suit. Again, kind of has a use like the Oviraptor, where it will buff something from your creatures. It will buff the XP. Just, again, for me, really just not a useful creature. You can't get anything out of these things. And number 1 is anything you really tame with the fish traps, as you do tame that creature if you let them out of the fish trap. And I know maybe you might say that's a little bit of a cheat and it doesn't count, but you have tamed it, so it's there. So coelacanths, saber-tooth salmons, trilobites, all of those things. The worst Ark tame just by far. Like, honestly, you can't use these things for anything. They're just there. Obviously, you can use them when in a fish basket to tame a Shadowmane. That's kind of nice. But you can't when they're out in this form, so that's why they're in at the number 1 spot.
Ark's top 10 most underrated tames. In at number 10 is the Angler. Now this thing was released way back, and I do definitely fondly remember this thing from Squid's old Ark series, and his last episode on the Bongoman's Island map was taming the anglerfish, and still to this day this is actually a pretty useful creature for some certain specific Ark tasks, especially with their silica pearl gathering abilities, and that is pretty much all they have going for them. But silica pearls, if you didn't know already, are an extremely useful Ark resource, so that is why they are an extremely useful Ark creature, which many people don't talk or even tame at all, and they just don't question it as a creature. They'll always go for something else. And yes, there are better sea creatures out there, but the Angler is great earlier on to mid-game stages in Ark, where you can't fully shell out for the most powerful ocean tames, but you still want to farm all of those silica pearls to get your fabrication up to the max. These creatures are really worth a tame at some point, as they aren't difficult at all, and they are extremely useful for gathering up all of those silica pearls. In at number 9 is the Chalacatherium. Now you may think this creature is just utterly useless, or you may think this creature is an absolutely insane tame and 100% worth it. and I'm kind of leaning more onto that side, as this creature does have a lot of abilities which many other creatures don't have. And also, the Chalicotherium has an absolutely insane knockback attack, and it is just a generally good creature for just dealing a lot of damage. It's a bit like a slightly worse Megatherium, which really does pack a punch, and it actually is a very decent travel mount as well. It has a very respectable speed stat, one of what you will not complain with at all, and it does have a wealth of other abilities as well, like it being able to throw literal rocks of, I think, even feces at the enemy player. But this ability will take some time to actually practice and get right, as it is a somewhat difficult ability to control, but when done right, it is a really fun, cool ability, which does have many uses as well, as it essentially makes this thing a long-range fighting dinosaur, which many other Ark creatures simply do not have. The only one I can really think of off of hand is the Velonosaur's turret ability. In at number 8 is the Carb Enemies. Now, I know this will be a somewhat unpopular opinion among many of you, but in my opinion, my personal opinion, I really do enjoy the Carb Enemies in the early stages of my Ark playing. In those early stages, it is extremely useful to get yourself a creature that can grind all of that oil and those silica pearls and all of those underwater resources. Yes, I will definitely agree this isn't the best creature out there to gather all of those berries and just harvest general things, as I'm pretty sure this thing can't even gather berries, but if it can, it is still an extremely slow Ark creature, which isn't great on land at all. But when it comes into the water, the Carb Enemies does actually have some reasonable speed. And yes, just for reference, this B-roll does have some boosted speed on the Carb Enemies, as I think it just looks really funny. And it definitely is really funny in my opinion. Comment down below if you think a really fast Carb Enemies waggling its little legs really quickly is funny. You know, some people do, and I'm definitely one of those people. But yes, as you can see here in the B-roll, this is me going to gather some oil from the kind of depths of the ocean. Not obviously right to the bottom, as that wouldn't be great, as your player would simply run out of oxygen. As the time when you're getting the Carb Enemies, you will not have the scuba tank. I'm pretty confident you won't. So yeah, you can always go into those lakes and lower lying rivers, and there you'll find some oil and definitely some silica pearls, and that is where I think the Carb Enemies really shines the most. In at number 7 is the Beelzebufo. Now, I know loads of people on my channel really do not feel as if the Beelzebufo is underrated, and they extremely love this creature, and they think it is one of the most popular Ark creatures. And among quite a lot of Ark players, the Beelzebufo is definitely very popular for its cementing paste gathering abilities. But the fact is, a lot of Ark players as well will simply discount the Beelzebufo, and I was one of them before I tried it, as they will just simply say beaver dams are the most efficient way to gather cementing paste, and there isn't a point of spending all of that time to get yourself one of these absolutely amazing, charming Ark frogs, which now obviously I've turned my opinion over is simply not the case. In insect caves like the one on the island, the Beelzebufo really does shine, and you can gather thousands and thousands of cementing paste. And with Ark being a buggy game as well, sometimes beaver dams don't even spawn and can be an absolute nuisance to find, so knowing that you can literally just find some insects on a Beelzebufo to get that cementing paste is actually extremely useful as well, where you just can't find beaver dams and you just can't find that cementing paste. The Beelzebufo is definitely the best creature out there for reliable, quick cementing paste gathering. In at number 6 is the Castoroides. Now again, you may be kind of on the edge like the Beelzebufo with this creature, as you may either love it or hate it. These creatures do seem to be quite Marmite creatures, as you may just not see the use in taming a Castoroides. But before you have the chainsaw in Ark, the Castoroides is one of the best creatures for gathering wood. And you all know wood is a resource which you will need a lot of throughout the game. Right from the beginning all the way to the end stages of the Ark game, you will need all of that wood. The amount of wood that you will need in one Ark map playthrough is absolutely insane, and the beaver will really help you to actually get you there. And also, the beaver is an extremely fast creature as well, and great in the water too, so it is a sort of upgrade to the Carb Enemies if you still can't get a creature that is underwater capable that actually spawns in the water, like the Megalodon or Ichthyosaurus or Plesiosaurus or Mosasaurus, which you may not have at the stage when you'll be taming these things.
things. And also on top of that, they have an extra little special spicy ability as well, which makes them really, really nice to use. The fact is, their saddle is just a really, really nice portable smithy, extremely useful. In at number 5 is the Spinosaurus, and what a creature this is, and also in my opinion, what an underrated carnivore, as the Rex always seems to take the spotlight away from the Spinosaurus, and in my opinion, the Spinosaurus is pretty much what a Rex is, and in some cases, it can be easier to tame, as it does spawn in less hostile environments, and it definitely has a lot of really, really great uses that the Rex simply can't partake in. Firstly, it has a really, really amazing turning circle, which the Rex simply can't compete with, as it can turn 360 on the spot, whereas the Rex's turning circle is absolutely atrocious, and in many situations it is so bad you can even get your Rex killed because it can't turn around and attack the creature that is attacking by its feet. Also, the Spinosaurus is great in the water too, and I'm pretty sure it does have an oxygen stat, even though it may not as well. I'm kind of a bit in between. It may have had one in the past and now it doesn't. Either way, its oxygen stat is really, really great, and it is a great underwater creature with creatures like the Baryonyx, the Mosasaurus, the Plesiosaurus, the Basilosaurus. The list literally goes on for underwater creatures, and unlike most underwater creatures, and pretty much every creature apart from this and the Shadowmane, it has the hydration buff, so it will do even more damage when in water, which is just simply great, as with any carnivore, you always like to have a buff. Sadly, it does not have the bleed ability, but still, that hydration buff is absolutely OP, and when it goes back onto its hind legs, this thing will do even more damage on top of that. It is definitely a great boss creature, and actually overall, I'm pretty sure it does more damage than the Rex, as it can attack faster, and I think its damage stat is higher. Its only real downside is its health is slightly worse than something like a Rex. In at number 4 is the Baryonyx. Now, this creature is definitely one of my favourites, and one creature that I will never forget in my Ark journey, and I'm surprised that so many other people don't talk about this to the extent that I do. And yes, it is not the most underrated creature out there, but I definitely think every single Ark player should have a Baryonyx in their roster of creatures, and they should know how to tame one effectively, efficiently, and know how to use one effectively as well. Yes, Shadowmanes are really great for caves now, but still the Baryonyx is my go-to 100%, as obviously its size means that this thing can fit into pretty much any cave. And compared to the Shadowmane, I'm just more used to using the Baryonyx, and yes, it may not be quite as versatile in terms of travel. In my opinion, this thing is still extremely, extremely useful and deserves a use, even though in some cases it is somewhat overtaken by the Shadowmane. Except the Shadowmane doesn't have the secret little ability that the Baryonyx has hidden up its sleeve. When it's in the water, it can literally stun creatures if you press C. And yes, the Shadowmane may have the hydration buff and things like that. The Shadowmane is a really great creature, don't get me wrong. It's just for things like caving and underwater exploration, I will always go Baryonyx before Shadowmane, and I would urge you to do that too. And also, they are a lot more accessible than the Shadowmane, as they do spawn on the island. Yes, I know the Shadowmane can be found on Fjorda, at least I'm pretty sure it can be found on Fjorda, so it is free to every Ark player out there, apart from Switch, I think doesn't have Fjorda yet, and obviously mobile doesn't. But on spawning on the island, it really does mean that this creature is the most accessible that it can be. Definitely worth the tame. In at number 3 is the Allosaurus. Yet again, another carnivore, which some people, again, may say they use all the time. But I really think the Allosaurus does not get the press that it really deserves, like the Spinosaurus and the Barry, as the Aloe is by far one of the best boss creatures in Ark in general. And yes, the Rex may have more health, but the Allosaurus does an extremely immense amount of damage in packs, and it is just by far one of the most useful combat creatures in Ark. And with its pack buff, which obviously it will get from being in a pack, it can be buffed even more than a Rex can. And if you combine that with UT buffs on top of that, and the Deon healing everything, you can have yourself a really, really great boss environment with Aloes. And if you do breeding and mutations, you can have yourself an absolutely insane pack of Aloes. And they don't tend to be as absolutely mind-bogglingly stupid as a Rex. These things will pretty much never get stuck on anything in the Ark terrain. And also, if you're doing the Overseer on the island, I would probably recommend bringing Aloes, as getting through the tech cave with Rexes just those Rexes, man, they will just get stuck in the lava and they will just die, and they'll just fall in the most stupid places, and it is really, really infuriating trying to retrieve them. So I will always use something like the Aloe or the Spino if I'm feeling like it for the Overseer boss on the island. And I've only used Rexes once, and I completely regret it, as pretty much all of my army was killed in the tech cave, as all of the Rexes just decided, I don't want to live anymore, and I'm just going to jump straight into that lava. But obviously the Aloe does not have any of those issues, and unlike the Rex, it has the all famous bleed ability. Definitely a carnivore to be proud and worth taming. In at number 2 is the Mantis. Now again, this is one of Ark's most accessible creatures, with this thing spawning on maps like Ragnarok. And yes, albeit it may not have the easiest taming method out there, requiring you to passive feed it woolly rhino horns on Ragnarok, or you can use Deathworm horns as well, and you will have to use Deathworm horns on the original map that it came on, which is Scorched Earth. And I get that many people do recognize the Mantis out there, but like the others, I really think everyone should have a Mantis in their roster, as some people may think it's just weak, useless, not worth it. Why even bother with all the prep and all of that just effort to get yourself some really good Mantises? And to that, I would say they are extremely great harvesters, and on a map like Ragnarok, these are by far the go-to creature for gathering all of that mutton up. And they're definitely really fun harvesters to use as well. And pretty much any melee weapon that you can think of, apart from tech melee weapons, I'm pretty sure, these things will be able to wield and use to such a high level of ability. The only real downside to using a Mantis with your tools is the durability factor to it. But if you have Ascendant tools, then you'll have a really great time, as those weapons are not going to break as often. The Mantis is definitely a tame every Ark player should have in their roster, and one every Ark player should tame, and in my opinion, it doesn't get the support that it actually really needs. And finally, in at number 1 is the Carnotaurus. Now, many people wouldn't have expected this thing to be in the number 1 slot, but in my opinion, the Carno is my favorite carnivore in Ark. Yes, I prefer it even above the Baryonyx. The amount of nostalgia I have with this creature and the amount of success I've had with this creature is absolutely insane. And when I did Genesis 1 for the first time, I beat the Master Controller, albeit on Gamma, with the Carnotauruses, and it went extremely well, and it was an extremely fun and useful boss fight for me to have. The Carnotauruses are actually a very viable boss creature, albeit they won't do what a Rex, a Spino, or an Aloe can. They are still a really good middleman for doing those Gamma boss fights, and you can definitely push for Beta and Alpha depending on what the fight is, just maybe not with the Master Controller. And did you also know that Carnotaurus, translated from Latin into English, means meatball, which is why I always call my Carnotauruses meatball, partly because it sounds funny, but also it is just accurate to what Carnotaurus actually means. Also, since the Carnotaurus' release, this thing has been TLC'd, now having a second attack where it will headbutt the enemy creature and deal that all-famous bleed ability, which only one other creature on this list so far, being the Allosaurus, actually has. And again, this is something that something like the Spino or the Rex doesn't have, which is why it is extremely useful to have yourself a Carnotaurus, and as always, call this thing Carny Dave. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I would really like to know, what are your top 10 most underrated Ark Tames, as I'd really like to hear your thoughts. But with that, I'll see you all later.